best eating house north of San Francisco. Canned, fresh, stewed, steamed, raw, in cocktails. The luscious bivalve. 10-cent cup of coffee with lunch counters.
Lost Restaurants of Napa Valley and their recipes.
Hi, my name is Danielle Barreca with the Napa County Historical Society Board of Directors. Thank you for tuning in today. It is because of the support of members like you that we are able to still provide content during this challenging time. Please consider renewing your membership or gifting a membership to a friend or family member. Thank you, and we hope you tune in again.
I want to welcome everybody to our first virtual event. We are making history tonight with our wonderful author, Alexandria Brown, who is going to be introducing her new book, with our board president, Tom Spalding, and many of you may know that he's a local historian along with a local photographer, and all of you. And I also want to say that we have Nikel Riggs, our research librarian, who's working behind the scenes with us, and there she is, she's waving, to help make this all possible too. This is truly a very special evening. My name is Liz Alessio, and I'm the Executive Director for the Napa County Historical Society. I want to tell you what you have to look forward to tonight. Tom's going to share a little more about Alexandria Brown. She will be reading two sections in her book, Forgotten Restaurants, on serving oysters. Following, actually let me say, during her presentation and her reading, feel free to ask any questions into the chat area. If you've not used chat, you will find it at the bottom of your screen. There's a toolbar that will be highlighted, and it's left to the green highlighted box. It says chat. Just click on that and you can just add your questions or comments if you like. Following the reading from Alexandria, Tom is going to lead us into discussion and a Q&A, and you'll be participating in this. So this is a live interactive event, so don't hesitate to be part of this. And now I'd like to introduce you to Tom Spalding. Enjoy.
Thank you, Liz. I speak not only for myself, but all of the Napa County Historical Society when I tell you that we're delighted to present Alexandria Brown today to share with us her new book, Lost Restaurants of Napa Valley and Their Recipes. Alexandria currently works as a teen services librarian. There's the book right there that Alexandria is holding up. She works as a teen services librarian in the North Bay, but she happens to be uniquely qualified through her background to write a book on this subject matter. I mean, first off, she was raised in the Napa Valley, so she probably ate at a couple of those lost restaurants at some point. She has earned master's degrees in both library and information science and United States history. She was the first research librarian of the Napa County Historical Society, a position that she held for more than 4 years. Many of you will, of course, remember her from the many tours that she led and events that she spoke at. And at those, she would often play Stump the Librarian, where she would field any question the audience could come up with related to Napa history. And in all the time she did it, I never saw her stumped. I know our long-term volunteers at the Historical Society, which are really the backbone of what we do in preserving historical records and making them available to the public. They all loved working with Alex, as you can tell by how thrilled they are to see her when she comes back to visit the Goodman Library sometimes. She also served on the board of directors of the Napa County Historical Society, and she continues to help us to this day, both by being a resource of institutional knowledge for us, and also by contributing to our social media presence. So hopefully some of you got to join us just over a year ago when she launched her previous book, The Hidden History of Napa Valley. This is my autographed copy here. And I'm sure this one's going to be just as exciting. And with that, I turn it over to Alexandria.
All right. Hello, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit out of the book. I've been reading different sections for different virtual readings that I've been a part of. So this one is one that I have not read yet. As Liz said, it's about oysters in a couple of different restaurants in Napa. Or I titled it, quote, The Luscious Bivalve, which was a description from a newspaper article, and it was just such a flowery description I could not use it. So this is part 2, The Luscious Bivalve. Oysters were consumed by indigenous people for millennia before British and European explorers ever set foot on North American soil. It took a while for the delicacy to catch on with Americans, but by the 1850s, they were one of the most popular foods to come out of New York City. Canned, fresh, stewed, steamed, raw, in cocktails, there were infinite ways to consume the mollusks, and Americans tried them all. Americans ate so many oysters that a war broke out between state authorities from Maryland and Virginia and oyster pirates pillaging the Chesapeake Bay and Potomac River. In the mid-19th century, oysters were particularly tied to saloons. When not consuming a variety of alcoholic beverages, bargoers guzzled down oysters by the bucketful. It did not take long for restaurants to jump on the oyster bandwagon. In Napa County, oyster houses proliferated and were often paired with lunch counters and chop houses. In St. Helena, the Elite Saloon offered a daily special of oysters from the East Coast, as well as free lunch anytime and clams on Friday. E. Heyman had oysters on the half shell available for railroad house customers indulging in wine, liquor, cigars, or billiards. The Arcade Saloon in Napa, no known connection to the Arcade restaurant, offered stewed, fried, and raw oysters brought up by boat from San Francisco. But A. Javon takes the cake for the most creative oyster enterprise. He ran a combination oyster saloon, coffee house, and market selling fish and vegetables out of his business on Main Street. On Tuesdays and Fridays, he had fresh fish for sale, and shrimp, crab, lobsters, oysters, and other shellfish were always available. Customers ordered groceries and then stuck around for a 10-cent cup of coffee and a plate of stewed or half-shell oysters for 2 bits, slang for 25 cents. Completed in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad made it easier to ship the bivalves to the gaping maws of oyster-mad Westerners. By the 1870s, oysters had been transplanted to California. The feat was so successful that the San Francisco Daily Post wrote, quote, "The largest bonanza in the way of a mine must inevitably be worked out in time, but the oyster wealth of the Gulf of California is inexhaustible, as all persons who are wise enough to become stockholders will by and by find to their entire satisfaction." All right, chapter 4, Arcade Restaurant. The earliest years of the Arcade Restaurant are hazy. It opened on Main Street in downtown Napa in the late 1850s or early 1860s. J.W. Davis became the proprietor in the summer of 1862 and offered meals at any time of day. In the advertisement where he announced he was taking over the restaurant, he also declared his intentions to establish himself in Napa. However, he seems to have been unsuccessful in both ventures. Davis appears in no official records, directories, or newspaper articles, except the one. A decade later, Patrick Milton Hogan was in charge. Not much is known about him, except that he was born in Ireland in about 1840. Beside the typical meals, Hogan instituted the Canal Street Plan, which he described as, quote, you call for what you want and pay only for what you get. Originating on Canal Street in New York City, this plan was common in oyster cellars that operated below the main saloon, where cooler temperatures kept the bivalves fresher longer. For a few cents, diners could eat as many oysters as they wanted. There were probably many oyster eateries in Napa County that operated on the Canal Street Plan, but only the Arcade Restaurant chose to advertise it in local newspapers. Like many of Napa's early dining establishments, the Arcade moved locations at least once. When he moved into the Charbon building at First and Main in 1873, Hogan hung a brand new sign that could be seen from several blocks up and down. The Napa Register commended him for making himself an enduring reputation as a restaurateur in Napa. He has made a credible attempt to furnish good meals at a cheap price and has succeeded. At his tables may be found fish, flesh, and fowl, and the fruits of the season. He served a wide range of dishes, including everything from a fat, juicy steak to hot chocolate to ham and eggs to mutton broth, and, of course, oysters, as a stew, in crumbs, on the half shell, or fried in eggs. Anti-Chinese fervor would not reach its peak until the 1890s, but Hogan was an early participant. In 1872, he was proud to advertise that he refused to hire Chinese cooks. At some point, Hogan gave up the Arcade and James C. Ritchie stepped in. Richie dreamed of getting a job at a wholesale grocery store in San Francisco, so he sold the restaurant to the Hattons in 1887. The job did not last, and Richie was back in town a few months later. He opened a new restaurant, The Fountain, on the east side of Main Street between 1st and 2nd. Eastern oysters and chicken dinners were one of the many dishes available at the best eating house north of San Francisco. Rooms were also available to boarders by the week or the month. Unfortunately, he filed for insolvency in 1892 when he could not pay off his debts of nearly $3,500. The Pickles took over the Fountain, but lost it after 2 years for failing to pay rent. Eventually, the property owner, Jacob F. Schwartz, expanded his hardware store into the old restaurant, and that was the end of that. As for the arcade, it did well under Edward and Sabina Hatton. Edward left his home in New Bedford, Massachusetts for California with his first wife, Susan, in the early 1850s. Once in Napa, he opened a barber shop and became one of several African-American barbers in the county. Civically minded and politically active, Edward was a North Bay District representative for the California Convention of Colored Citizens, the CCC, a series of conventions held between 1855 and 1865 where African Americans worked together to push for citizenship rights. At the time, in California, as with most of the United States, people of color and indigenous people were barred from many public facilities and could not testify in court, vote, or attend public school. The CCC also worked with abolitionists to end slavery. Later, Edward became a contributor and agent for the San Francisco-based newspapers, The Pacific Appeal and The Elevator, both of which were written by and for African Americans, and was among the first group of Black Napans to register to vote after the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Susan passed away in the late 1860s or early 1870s, and Edward remarried, this time to widow Sabina H. Dyer. Sabina and Edward's restaurant was open all hours of the day and evening and kept tables always supplied with the best the market affords. After a few months, they gave the restaurant over to Margaret E. Hatton, who may have been one of Edward's daughters or daughter-in-law. Edward and Sabina moved back to San Francisco, where he remained until his death in 1889. Margaret had the arcade restaurant less than a year before it burned to the ground in 1888. The fire broke out at 1 a.m. between the restaurant and True's Saloon and spread to nearby buildings, even threatening the Napa Hotel across the street. It took 4 different fire companies nearly 2 hours to put out the flames, and when they were done, 6 businesses were destroyed and $10,000 in damage was done. Margaret got out of the restaurant business, and the arcade never reopened. On that happy note, yay!
Thank you, Alex. That was lovely. I'm looking forward to getting my copy. So we're going to start with a couple general questions.
All right.
We've already had at least one from our audience submitted here we'll get to, but curious about how you're dealing with the shelter-in-place order over in Sonoma County. How does it affect your research and writing?
Other than slowly losing my mind as I sit at home, it's going okay over here, about as well as it's going in Napa. As far as my writing goes, it's been kind of odd. The stuff that I'm writing for me, sort of creatively, I've actually been like going to town. I've outlined 2 novels. It's been great. The stuff that I'm getting paid to write has been like pulling teeth, and I'm not quite sure where the difference lies, but it has been some of the hardest work I've done trying to write professionally, and the stuff I'm being paid to write has been very challenging to get through. And talking to many of my other writer friends, and we're all kind of in this same headspace of either we can crank out a lot of stuff and it's great, or we've just hit a wall.
Not much middle ground.
Yeah.
So we had a general question here. How do you choose your research and writing projects? But we also had the audience more specifically asked about this book. What was it that excited you about restaurants, or what made you take on this particular project?
Both are very good questions, and I can kind of collapse that into one big answer. For about 10 years or so now, I think July will be my 10th anniversary, I've been a writer for a website called tour.com, and they write science fiction, fantasy, and adjacent sort of geeky stuff. So reviews and, essays and personal stories, all kinds of stuff like that. It's all sort of nonfiction/nonfiction creative writing. And all of those things I'm paid to write, and I have deadlines and things like that. And sometimes they say, Alex, will you write this? And I say yes, and then I have to write it, whether I have a muse or not. So this is kind of a long way of going around and saying, a lot of people will ask about the muse and what inspires you to write. And the people who say that they rely on the muses are rich people who don't have to eat based on what they write. I rely very heavily on my paychecks for writing. So I don't have time to wait for a muse. I try to find the thing that interests me in what I write, of course. But, the short kind of pithy answer of why I wrote this book was that History Press asked me to write it, and they offered to pay me. I get money, I get royalties from writing the book, and so I wrote the book. But the deeper answer is that when they asked me to write a book about restaurants, I took a couple of months and I thought about it, and I tried to really find what the heart of the story was. Like with Hidden History, I didn't want to just write the standard history of Napa that you see everywhere. George Ott showed up in 1830, blah, blah, blah. I don't care. I don't care. So it took me a while to figure out what the restaurant story really was. I looked at a lot of examples, and some books in this series, here's the restaurant, here's the address, these are the years that it operated, these are the food that it served, here's the next restaurant. And I thought that was just really, really not interesting to me. I didn't want a directory of restaurants. But the more I started digging, I started seeing these larger themes. So kind of like what I did with Hidden History in Lost Restaurants, I didn't just write about Chinese restaurants in Napa. I was able to use certain restaurants to tell the story of the Chinese experience in Napa County. With the Mexican food chapter, using different people who were serving and selling tamales and different types of Mexican food to tell the story of Mexicans and Mexican Americans and Californios in Napa County. So it kind of got bigger. It's not just about restaurants. It's sort of food history and a history of who we are and how what we eat has changed us as a people. So that's why I wrote the book. I wanted to write about, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Napa, and I found a way to do it through food.
Okay, so you're talking about how you personalize the projects. You find a way to make it yours, get it steered into the subject areas that you're interested in, instead of just the most simple way of addressing what the client wants. In this book, was there something particularly exciting that a particular story you uncovered that excited you?
So much. When I started writing it, I knew I was going to hit the big ones. I was going to hit Tailors and Jonesys and Palby's. But I didn't really know anything about the quote unquote ethnic foods in Napa, the history of, I knew obviously there were Chinese people and I knew they were eating Chinese food, but I didn't really know much about how non-Chinese people were consuming Chinese food in Napa and Mexican food and all these other things. So it was really, really exciting. It really shifted my perspective of historic Napa. Like we think of what we think of as American food today wasn't American food 100 years ago. So all of it was pretty exciting. But the one thing, actually, Nikel will recognize this name. I found 2 Japanese American restaurateurs who ran a restaurant in Napa City, in the early 1900s, named I'm going to mess up their first initials, Kotoku and Nakagawa, I believe were their names. They're mentioned in the book. And I spent hours and days digging through the internet, and I emailed Nikel and I was like, can you find anything on these people? And we never found any information. But that was the coolest find for me personally. I was really excited. I wasn't looking for them. I just happened to find, and it's that shift, we think it was, restaurants are owned by, rich old white dudes, and weren't, even in the 1900s, there's a diversity of people participating in our economy and in participating in unexpected ways. So I thought that was pretty neat.
So it sounds like there were some connections then with your previous book, The Hidden Histories, then, and the same stories of certain communities in Napa. How did the process of publishing Hidden History change how you approached researching and writing Lost Restaurants?
Well, the big one was that I knew I did not want anything quite as weighty in the research process as hidden history. Hidden history, I had about 18 months to research and write, and I think I researched about 12 months out of that. Like it was, I was working at a high school at the time, and I just did nothing but research for an entire summer, and I thought I was going to lose my mind. So I needed something that was a little bit less research intensive because I only had 7 months to research and write this book. My research process changed in that, I had figured out, it took me a while to figure out a efficient way to search the Napa Library's digitized newspapers. I love the digitized newspapers from the library. Thank you so much, from Napa County Library. It is the worst search mechanism in the history of the world. It's terrible. So it took me a lot of practice, but I had figured out a system for that. I ended up having to do some traveling for research for this one, oddly enough. There were a couple of issues from the older newspapers, especially the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, that had been lost in the Napa Library in the last couple of decades, so they weren't digitized. So I went up to Sacramento a couple of times to the State Library, State Archives. And also I had a friend who lived down in Los Angeles at the time, and so I collapsed a fun trip and a research trip and went to the Huntington Research Library, let me into their archives to look at some, they've got the newspapers from the 1850s down there, and that was really amazing. So it was kind of different in that way. But otherwise, the general process was fairly similar. I figured out what worked and, kind of wrote chapter by chapter. And so for 3 weeks, all I was doing was reading things about oysters.
So I think you did some interviews for this too. Did you track down descendants and family members and find anything interesting that way?
Yes, actually, you reminded me. Yes, that was one thing that I didn't get to do as much of with hidden history. But I did track down, Herman Soon, who's connected through like the A1 Cafe and Asia Cafe, and a couple of other people, the Taylor family who owned Taylor's Refreshers up in St. Helena. A few other people I was able to, one of the easiest ways that I did it was I did a big Facebook post, and I was like, these are the restaurants that I've got. Anybody know any of these people there? The family that owned the Magnolia Hotel in Yountville reached out to me through that way. Some people connected with Palby's. Taylor's was really hard. I literally sat there and just Googled and Googled and Googled. And finally, I found the name of a lawyer that had been involved in a case that they worked on, back with the name change thing. And his phone number happened to still be, or his email was still accurate. So I emailed him, I was like, I'm desperate. Do you still have connections with them? And within 20 minutes, I had the grandson of Popsy on the phone, and they were tremendous. So lots of people helped out.
I'm going to take a look at some of the questions we've had submitted here.
All right.
One says, I'm fascinated by the recipes you included in the book. Have you had an opportunity to try it?
I've been asked this before, and sadly the answer is no. When I wrote the book, I was living in a place that did not have a kitchen. I only had a kitchenette, so I could not pre-bake anything or try anything before I made it. However, I do hope to make some stuff. There's a bunch of recipes that I didn't include that I've been sort of keeping stashed away, that sound pretty tasty. Especially, I found one for French toast. Actually, I included it. So if you buy the book, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry, but if you buy the book from Napa Book Mine, some of the postcards that I'm including in it are coming with historic recipes that are outtakes from the book. One of those that I included was a recipe for French toast, but instead of cinnamon and sugar, the recipe calls for salt and pepper. So I'm really curious to try that one. Everything is the same, except it's salt and pepper instead of cinnamon and sugar.
Well, you can let us know before we try that one. We may have already sort of covered this, but we had, what was the single most interesting thing you discovered in your research?
Let's see. Well,
hard to pin down.
Japanese Americans. Oh, the history of chop suey was actually really fascinating. I won't get into it too much because it's really complicated. But basically, whatever you think the story is of the origin of chop suey, you're wrong, and it's not what happened. There's a lot of myths tied around to it, and sort of pulling out and exploring those myths and trying to figure out what the truth was really, really fascinating. Every story I kept finding, lie, this is the story. And then another book, that's a lie, this is the story. And I found all these recipes too for chop suey. I included 2 of them in the book, but all of these recipes I would find and say, this is the definitive recipe for chop suey. This is how it's made in China, and this is exactly it. And then it's completely different from this next recipe that I found. So this is the definitive recipe for chop suey. This is how they make it in China. And none of them were how they made it in China because they didn't make chop suey in China. So, but I found it to be a really fascinating tangle that took me a good week to sort of parse out and figure out what was going on.
All right, let's get to, here's one about a friend of yours. Have you talked with Don Winter about the possible overlap between restaurants and his work with lodging in hotels in Napa Valley?
I think we chatted very, very early on. Actually, I think it's before I pitched the book. I chatted with him. I working through the Historical Society, I'd done a lot of work with him on his hotels, so I'd learned a lot already. And he's one of the reasons that I included Etna Springs, because I know he'd done a lot of work, and I had done a lot of work with him. And then, of course, Hope Valley Day from many years ago at Historical Society when we did the tour of Etna Springs. So I didn't work with him directly on this book, but I've worked with him so much in the past that there's definitely a lot of overlap there.
Next question: what is the oldest restaurant in Napa? Have you determined?
The oldest currently existing restaurant, or the oldest in general?
Well, let's go for both of them.
Okay. The longest running restaurant, I should say, the longest running restaurant in, at least in Napa City, and I believe in the county, I think, you know what, I'm not 100% certain, but I think it might be Asia Cafe. They've been around for a really, really, really long time. So I think it might be Asia Cafe in downtown Napa. It's certainly one of the longest running, it is certainly the longest running Chinese restaurant in the county. The oldest restaurant in terms of which was the first one done, that depends on how you define restaurant. And I'm going to split some hairs here because I, in the book, define restaurant very, very broadly. What we think of as a restaurant today is not what somebody in 1850 would have thought of as a restaurant. In the 1850s, they would have thought it was Parisian. You go back, to the 1700s, and a restaurant is actually a broth that sick rich people ate at, fancy places in Paris. So how I defined restaurant in terms of the book was a place where somebody could go and get food that they paid for. Whether that means at a saloon, whether that means at a bar, whether it means at a hotel or a resort, or an actual, what we think of as restaurant today, or burger joint, whatever. So in that case, it would be the Empire Saloon, which almost opened in spring 1848, and Harrison, Pierce and Company heard about gold and sort of abandoned shop and went up and attempted to make their living and failed and came home, and he reopened the bar in summer or fall of 1848. And they served coffee, hardtack, and I think bread, something like that.
All right, so you had an aspiring writer here who's wondering if you have any advice for those who want to write a book.
Write the book. I know it sounds pithy, but just write the book. You've got the story. If it's a story that only you can tell, then write the book. If it's research-based, if it's nonfiction, there are so many local historical resources. Napa County Historical Society is a great place to start. If it's fiction, the best advice I can give you is that the first draft is just a first draft. Do not edit as you go, just write it, and you can go back and look at it later. It doesn't even have to be good, it just has to be done. So really, just write. Don't get distracted. Don't turn yourself off. Don't worry if anybody else has told the story before. You can give me as many vampire stories as there are vampires. Just give it me all. I don't care. Just tell your story. Don't let anybody discourage you from that.
Does it get easier as you go along with writing? I mean, writing a second book, was that easier than the first? And was the first easier than your master's thesis or whatever?
Oh, thesis. Yes and no. I mean, the process was easier because I had a system now and I knew how best to write it, or, you know, what worked efficiently for me, which would probably not work efficiently for anybody else. I use Google Docs and I swear by it. I just made 8,992 new copies of everything. Each day would get a new copy of it. So there's an endless sea of old drafts in my Google Docs. But the actual act of writing is still very hard. And like, you know, like I was just saying in my advice, the only way I could ever get it done without freaking out was to I just crank out the first draft of it. A lot of times it wouldn't even make any logical sense. I just, you know, paragraph on Hogan's biography goes here, and then I'd skip down and write more about whatever it was, and I'd fill in later. But just getting it written and then putting it aside and coming back a week later with fresh eyes and then getting all the creative juices flowing, that's still really, really hard. Writing is hard.
We had questions about specific restaurants. If you happen to have researched any of them, I'm not, if you haven't, that's fine too. But people were interested in Vance's Inn, Yountville Saloon, and the French Laundry.
Yountville Saloon, no, I did not do any research on Yountville Saloon. I do remember seeing it when I was going through the newspaper records and stuff like that, but I didn't dig into that one. Vance's, I think was the same way. I remember encountering Vance's, but again, I didn't end up doing research on like 8 million restaurants. I mean, there's so many restaurants in Napa County. I just picked the one, you know, I would look at a whole bunch of restaurants, look at the ones that I could get the most information, you know, narrow it down by ones I could get the most information and most descriptions of their food on, and then narrow it down again to say which one could help me tell the story of whatever. So I can't tell you too much about, I can't tell you really anything about Yountville Saloon or Vance's. French Laundry, I can tell you, it's sort of vaguely, or it's sort of indirectly connected to my chapter on the Magnolia Hotel, because the, and I'm going to blank on his name, he was actually Basque. He was not French, but he has a French.
Pierre Guillaume?
Yes, thank you. Pierre Guillaume, whatever his name is. Yeah, he was from northern Spain, not France. But anyways, he opened or bought or constructed, nobody's quite sure, the stone building that the Magnolia Hotel used to operate out of. And his brother-in-law, his French wife's brother, was the one that operated the French Laundry. Pierre owned the building that the French Laundry is in, and his brother-in-law his brother-in-law was French and operated a laundry out of it. Jump 400 years later and you get a restaurant that's called the French Laundry because of John Landy. I also know that my mother ate at the French Laundry way back when it first opened, and they were very desperate for guests. And one of her coworkers, she worked at the Queen, one of her coworkers was dating a waiter at the restaurant. And when they were really hard up for guests, my mother and her friends would get to eat at the French Laundry super cheap because they wanted to fill a room.
Oh. There is a connection from you having grown up here.
Yes, there's always a connection. Don't get me started on Jonesys.
And we had another question, just how is it to be hosting this reading virtually?
It's actually a lot of fun. This is, I can't even remember, the third or fourth Zoom sort of event thing that I've done since shelter in place. And I think it's actually kind of fun. I mean, obviously I'd love to be in person and throwing my book at you physically, but I like doing this virtually. It's pretty cool. And I'm very excited that this is Napa County Historical Society's first Zoom thing. I feel very honored.
Well, I think that I'd finish with a question. Just was there anything interesting I should have asked that I didn't that you'd like to talk about your book?
Let's see. Let's see. Well, I guess I'll just very quickly. I did include a chapter on Jonesys, and I included a chapter on Tailors. And I will say those are like my two, when I even thought about before I was going to write this book, what restaurants would I include? Those two were the big ones that I had to include. Jonesys is, my mother used to be a pilot at the airport, so Jonesys holds kind of a special place. And Tailors was always the place that my mother and I would go. So I grew up Seventh-day Adventist. I'm not in the church anymore. But Saturdays after church, we would drive up to Tailors as like a special treat. Back when it was Tailors, way back before the Gots. And that's one of those childhood memories. Like, it's like, oh my God, I went to Tailors. So I had to include that. That's my personal little bit of love story there.
Maybe you could have an event up at GOT sometime.
If they'll have
me. Get together again. One other question I forgot about it. So what's next? What are you researching? What are you working on now for that would be of interest to the Napa County Historical Society membership?
What's next, actually, in the immediate, I'm working on some fiction. I've outlined a novella, and I'm outlining right now a novel, urban fantasy novella, and a young adult romance novel. In terms of nonfiction, I'm planning on writing a book specifically just about Black history in Napa. Nobody else, just Black people. But the big thing that I'm waiting on is the 1950 census, and that doesn't come out till, I can't remember if it's 2021 or 2022. I think it's 2022. It's every 72 years. So I've got a couple more years. There's a lot of, when I wrote my thesis, I realized that there were some assumptions that I was making about the 60s and 70s that were big assumptions because I did not have any information on the 1950s. So if I can get that census and start digging around, then I can actually jump forward pretty far. So that's my next big nonfiction project, but not for a couple of years.
That's great. I'm looking forward to that. Shall we go on to Liz? Back to Liz now?
Sure.
Want to wrap this up?
Alexandria, thank you so much. I do have a question for everybody here, and that is, where can we buy your book?
Oh, yes. I hinted at it earlier. You can buy it at Copperfields, of course. You can also buy it at Napa Book Mine. And like I said, Napa Book Mine, I will be mailing them off to them next week.
Great.
If you buy from Napa Book Mine, I've signed some postcards. And some of them just have little doodles on them. Some of them just have my signature on them. But some of them have, let me see if I can find some of them I actually transcribed some of the historic recipes from the 1860s or 1870s and 1890s. So they will be scattered in, I don't know how they're gonna do that, but all kinds of stuff. That's where, those are the two places I always recommend. Buy indie, buy local if you can.
Yes.
Get it at, the big, evil, awful place online that goes by Amazon. Get Barnes and Nobles, all those other places too.
Well, thank you. And I do hope that we get your book in here. As we have your other book already, we're going to have to get your book here in the Historical Society.
Yes.
So when we can open again to the public, they can come in and get a copy here also. And if we can twist your arm, maybe we'll get some signed copies that folks can purchase.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Again, I want to thank everybody. This really is a historic event. It couldn't be better with all of you and Alexandria Brown to be part of this special evening. We have some other virtual events that we've been hosting, and on every other Wednesday, we have a storytelling night. This is at 7 o'clock. Last Wednesday was the first part of 3 of Tom Spalding's virtual tour out at Tula Cay Cemetery. And his tour is called Mansion for the Dead. Many people, as we've given tours at Tula Cay, have had questions about the mausoleums and the family history connected to those mausoleums. So it really is fascinating. He does have a, I wouldn't say co-host, but he has a secret guest that comes and gives us all a little bit of a surprise and a chuckle. So you'll see that. And this truly is a family event from the Spaldings. So please don't miss that. That's on Wednesday the 13th. and also in the following Wednesday. I believe that would be the 20th. Additionally, we have our second ever virtual event is by women's voters. And this is something that we were to host in our building here before we've had this pandemic. And so we're very grateful that we'll be hosting our next event, which is the alternating Friday from our Storytelling Friday. And that's called Echoes of Women. And Veda is going to be our guest speaker on that. And we hope you again can join us. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't make a plug to be a member or get your family and friends to be members of the Napa County Historical Society. It really is how we continue our mission to keep this beautiful, amazing local history alive. You know, I always tell people, you can be instantly smart, instantly, by just being a member. It's all about association. So the membership prices are still the same. And so not only can you support our mission and can support what we do, but you also get some really wonderful discounts that you can also enjoy. So thank you very much. We thank you, everybody, and we wish you a well and safe evening and hope to see you soon. Thanks, everybody.